One of the main questions that comes to everybody's mind is, why does NATO exist, and how do you assess the outcome of its actions up until 2022, before this war started in Ukraine?
Well, there's several answers to that. The facetious one now is that NATO exists to handle the threat that its existence creates. In other words, it is what the military call a self-licking ice cream cone. On the other hand, more seriously, there is a need for a pan-European security architecture. NATO potentially could have provided that. That is what the Partnership for Peace, which NATO launched at the beginning of the 1990s, was intended to do. But NATO essentially transformed itself in two ways. First, for the first time in its history, it began to conduct offensive military operations against Serbia to detach Kosovo, in Afghanistan after 9/11, in Libya with an a la carte operation justified as humanitarian, but in fact intended to engineer regime change. The second thing that NATO did that changed it, and of course, these things were beyond the scope of the NATO treaty, which is limited to the territory of its members. These were beyond the membership, the area of the membership. The second thing that NATO did was expand relentlessly to the east, despite assurances to the Russian leadership that it would not. And everywhere that NATO took on a new member, American troops and weapons also appeared deployed forward. So in effect, the combination of NATO's transformation from a purely defensive to an offensive alliance, and its extension to the borders of Russia, the announcement in particular of an intention to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, and thereby incorporate them in an American sphere of influence in Europe. This alarmed the Russians, and the result was that in December 2022, the Russians demanded a negotiation of a security architecture in Europe that would meet their concerns. And they also demanded the neutralization of Ukraine. When the United States and NATO refused to talk, Russia used force against Ukraine. So that is the history. And it's a great lesson, I think, that sometimes diplomacy is necessary, and military deployments and deterrence have their limitations.
What are the deep causes of this war in Ukraine?
In 2014, when a then elected president of Ukraine said that he would prefer to join the Russian-sponsored economic grouping rather than accept the European Union's offer, the United States engineered a coup d'etat in Kyiv. This was in the Maidan. It was something that was supported by the United States quite openly. In fact, telephone calls between Assistant Secretary for European Affairs Victoria Nuland and the American ambassador to Ukraine at the time spoke quite openly of the plan to replace the elected leadership of Ukraine with someone else. The first thing that the new government installed by the coup did, of course, it was recognized immediately by the United States. The first thing that it did was to outlaw the use of minority languages in Ukraine and to insist that only Ukrainian be used for communication with the government or educational purposes. Well, about a third of Ukrainians are actually native Russian speakers, And there are many others, for example, 150,000 Hungarian speakers, Romanian speakers, Polish speakers, many minorities in Ukraine, all of whom found this unacceptable. In the case of the Russian speakers, who were predominant in the East, in the Donbass region, and also in parts of the South, for example, a formidable presence in Odessa, there were first demonstrations, and then there was an effort to secede from Ukraine. In this context, and partly for this reason, but also for strategic reasons, Russia annexed Crimea. Why? Because for 250 years, Sevastopol, the main city, port city in Crimea, has been the Russian naval port in the Black Sea. And were Ukraine to join NATO, and Crimea still to be part of Ukraine, this Russian naval base would have come under US and NATO control, which is not acceptable. It happens that the Crimeans, who are about 75% native Russian speakers, had twice before conducted referenda trying to separate themselves from Ukraine. So the Russians, without no bloodshed, organized a referendum in which the voters in Crimea again voted to leave Ukraine and to become part of Russia. This referendum was illegal. It was not internationally supervised, but there's no reason to doubt that the results were valid. I mean, they were consistent with previous votes in Crimea. Meanwhile, in the Donbass, Russian speakers were attempting to secede. The government in Kyiv sent troops to try to subdue them. Because the Ukrainian army at that time was very weak, these troops were mostly drawn from so-called neo-Nazi or ultra-nationalist forces, which were quite brutal. And in response to the Ukrainian attack on the Donbass, the Russians began to help the Ukrainian secessionists there. So we got into a civil war in Ukraine between ultranationalists hailing from the West and Russian speakers seeking to protect their linguistic rights in the East. In 2015, at Minsk, the European great powers, France and Germany, under the auspices of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, conducted a mediation. This resulted in 2 successive accords, under which the civil war would have ended. Russia would have accepted that the Donbass remain part of Ukraine, although it would have rights equivalent to those of, let's say, Quebec in Canada, the right to use its own language and for official purposes and education, or let us say the Italians in the Tyrol area of Austria. Austria is relevant here because staring us in the face was a perfect diplomatic solution. And that was the Austrian State Treaty of 1955-56, by which, at the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France, which had occupied what became Austria, created the new state of Austria and withdrew their forces on the understanding that Austria would do 2 things. First, in the treaty by which Austria was established, Austria would treat its minorities, its Hungarians, its Slovenes, its Italian speakers, fairly. Second, Austria, not in the treaty, but by common understanding, would not join any bloc. It would remain neutral as between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. And indeed, Austria has complied with these terms and has become a very prosperous, neutral, independent, and democratic state. This was a model for Ukraine, which was rejected by those who wanted to expand NATO to include Ukraine. And it would have been perfectly acceptable, I believe, to Moscow. It was quite consistent with what Moscow demanded finally in December 2021, but it was never really considered. I should end by saying that when the war began, February 24th, 2022, Russia sent troops into Ukraine. Within a month, thanks to the intervention of the then Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, and the government of Turkey under Mr. Erdogan, there was a mediation between the Russians and Ukrainians, and negotiators, this draft of treaty went through 18 different drafts, and it was finally approved by both sides, the negotiators for both sides, but only ad referendum, meaning that the approval had to be endorsed or ratified by higher authority. Mr. Zelensky, then the president of Ukraine, announced that Ukraine was prepared to become neutral, made that public announcement. And then he was suddenly visited by Boris Johnson, then the Prime Minister of the UK, of Great Britain, who persuaded him to withdraw his acceptance of the treaty and his offer of neutrality. Allegedly, Mr. Johnson said, Ukraine may be ready to end this war, but NATO is not. So the war became, it was at first, as you said, a civil war. It became a proxy war between NATO, US forces, and Russia. And then it became a proxy war directly between the United States and Russia. I would add one final point, and that is, in the 8 years between the Donbass attempted secession and the outbreak of the Civil War and the Russian invasion, Ukraine's army grew to 700,000 active duty soldiers with another 1 million men in reserve. And these soldiers had been hardened in battle with the Russian-supported secessionists in Donbass and with Russian troops who were assisting them. They had been trained and equipped to NATO standards. So the interesting thing is, everybody talks about, Ukraine being so weak. Ukraine was actually very strong. 700,000 active duty soldiers was more than the combined forces of Britain, Germany, and France. More than the largest armed force in NATO is the United States, followed by Turkey. This was almost as large as the Turkish armed forces. So it is not true that Russia did not have a basis for fearing the expansion of NATO to its borders.
In your opinion, what was the necessity of the 2014 coup in Ukraine from the US point of view?
I think the US point of view may be a bit too broad a concept for this. This was very much a neoconservative factional effort. That is what Victoria Nuland represents, and that is what the cabal in the White House at the time dealing with Europe represented. They were determined for various reasons to expand, to take Ukraine into the American sphere of influence. One of these had to do with ethnic politics in the United States. There are many ethnic Eastern Europeans in the United States whose experience with Russia in the past has made them very fearful of Russia, and understandably so. So any politician who wants to take national office must pay attention to the opinions of these voters who are concentrated in key cities and states in our country. So that's one thing. The second was that some of these people themselves were of Ukrainian origin. Victoria Nuland herself is of Ukrainian origin, and had a very strong sympathy for the Ukrainian nationalism that the ultranationalist government in Kyiv represented. And the third factor was that the basis of neoconservatism in Europe was the notion that the Cold War was the proper way to organize affairs in Europe, that Europe needed to be divided between an American sphere of influence and Russia. So putting Ukraine into NATO served all of these purposes: domestic political purposes, emotional attachments to Ukraine, and the strategic purpose of boxing in Russia.
In February 2022, they started go into Ukraine, and right after that, before starting anything, they start negotiating with the Zelensky administration in Turkey. In your opinion, why the Biden administration didn't support those negotiations?
Well, clearly they made very clear what their objective was in the war, which was to isolate and weaken Russia. There was nothing in that statement about protecting Ukrainians or preserving Ukraine as it was. So basically, they wanted to use the Ukrainians as cannon fodder against the Russians, and they were doing that. And that is why Boris Johnson apparently said what he did in Kyiv in early April 2022, when he talked Zelensky out of agreeing to the treaty that had been drafted and agreed to by the negotiators in Turkey.
We know that the Ukrainian army before this war started was so strong, was so well prepared. Some experts believe that by September 2022, the majority of that army was already destroyed. But even after this event, this important event, the Biden administration didn't back down. They started sending more weapons, more funds to Ukraine. What's the end game here?
Well, that's the sad thing. There is no end game. Nobody should start a war without, and clearly we knew that if we rejected negotiations, the Russians would invade. And we in fact said so. And the intelligence agencies in the West, primarily in the United States and the UK, trumpeted the notion that the Russians were about to invade, claiming that by doing so, they were deterring a Russian invasion. I'm not quite sure how that logic works, but that was the claim. So clearly we knew there would be an invasion. From our point of view, I guess, I should say from the point of view of the Biden administration, because I don't agree with this, persisting in the war would take a heavy toll on Russia. Now, this brings me to a key point, and that is that every side in this war has made serious miscalculations. Mr. Putin apparently believed what he was told by his own intelligence people, I guess, that Ukrainians would welcome the liberation of Kyiv from the ultranationalist faction that had taken control there. That was clearly wrong. He did not expect the West to reject his negotiations. He didn't have a coherent plan for invading Ukraine. He had not briefed his generals that he intended to do so, and he had not lined up the logistical support to enable success. So that his decision to invade looks very much like a last-minute surprise. And of course, finally, everything that he did, invading another country's sovereignty, even if you have legitimate concerns about its orientation and alignment strategically, is illegal under international law. It's entirely illegal. There's no justification for it. So he made serious misjudgments. The United States and NATO made serious misjudgments. I think it's clear that the West believed that the sanctions would bring Russia to its knees. That has not happened. On the contrary, Russia has grown economically, and in terms of purchasing power parity, it is now the largest economy in Europe, larger even than Germany. Its growth rate is higher. We thought, I suppose, that the bungling that the Russian army evidenced in the first days of the war, a very poor performance by them, meant that they were no good and they would be defeated. Instead, they have managed to learn how to counter every new weapon system that the United States and others have introduced as the war has gone forward. And the West has escalated constantly, and Russia has counter-escalated. I think the United States, some people in the United States calculated that the war would make Mr. Putin so unpopular that he might be overthrown. That has not happened. That is not what was at stake when Mr. Prigozhin and the Wagner Group conducted their pathetic attempted march on Moscow. Russia has, instead of losing its power, now produces about 12 times as much ammunition per year as it once did, is developing new weapon systems, has a military economy that is greatly expanded. The Russian defense budget, which was $54 billion at the time of the war began, is now twice that. So we have not weakened Russia, nor have we isolated it. It has instead turned east and south to China, to India, to the Middle East. Turkish relationships with Russia have prospered in this environment. And now Russia is exerting itself in Africa. So I don't think the United States achieved any of its objectives, or NATO. Finally, Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky clearly believed that the West would protect him and that he could succeed with Western help. And instead, there's a mountain of dead Ukrainians. And at least 2 armies have been destroyed, and the third one is now being destroyed against heavily dug-in Russian defenses. We're probably about to see some kind of Russian offensive. Ukraine has lost territory that is crucial in the east and the south. It may lose its access to the Black Sea and become landlocked. And furthermore, just to go back to the most ironic thing, even NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, and of course the National Security Advisor in the United States, Jake Sullivan, both admit that Ukraine cannot join NATO now. So Ukraine is going to have to be neutral, but it will be a maimed, wounded, smaller, less populous Ukraine. On the last point, Ukraine has lost a third of its population since this war began. It's now probably got about 20 million people, where it started with 32 or 33 million. So for Ukraine, this has been an unmitigated catastrophe, and it shows no sign of getting better. So I say all the parties to this made terrible errors of judgment, and all are paying the price.
In your website, you send me the link. It's so remarkable the way you explain how this war started. I'll put the link in the description of this video. You mentioned war aims in Ukraine. You divide this, the US aims, Ukraine aims, and Russian aims.
Well, I think the Ukrainians have been very clear from the beginning. That is, the government in Kyiv has been very clear from the beginning what it wants to do. It wants to assimilate minorities, force them to Ukrainianize, if you will. It wants to recapture the Donbass. It wants to retake Crimea from Russia. It wants to join NATO, and it wants to be oriented toward the West and the EU. Now, I know in this regard that the first 3 objectives are now probably impossible. That is to say, Ukraine cannot retake the Donbass. Ukrainian nationalism has been greatly reinforced by this experience. There really is a Ukrainian nationalism now, in a sense that there wasn't. Even some Russian speakers in Ukraine now identify with Kyiv in ways that they didn't before. But the opposite is also true. Russian speakers in Ukraine, in the Donbass in particular, and now are not, you cannot be reconciled with the government in Kyiv. Too much blood has been shed. So Ukraine is not going to regain Crimea or the Donbass or Zaporizhia or Kherson, the portion that the Russians have. It may lose more territory, but it's been consistent in its objectives. The Russians have been consistent too. They've always said they want a negotiated reorganization of European security. They want Ukraine to be neutral. They want no U.S. forces on their border. And they want the protection of the Russian speakers in Ukraine. These are their objectives. They remain their objectives. They've not changed. U.S. objectives have been very, very unclear. You know, to say we'll continue with this, you know, whatever it takes, is not to define an objective. And I said at the outset, you know, if you enter a war with no clear objectives, no feasible objectives, no plan for achieving any objectives, and no plan for war termination, you are creating what we call a forever war. And that is what we have created. So Mr. Biden, our president, stands up before the UN General Assembly and repudiates the idea of any peace negotiation with Russia on the grounds that it would, quote, reward Russian aggression. But you never can, you know, I mean, let's be realistic. You do not regain at the negotiating table what you have lost on the battlefield. And or you cannot regain at the negotiating table what the hearts of the people have given up. So I think there will be a negotiation. It will be on terms that are very unfavorable to Ukraine. Ukraine will end up with much less than it could have had if the Turkish-Israeli mediation had been left alone, or the Minsk agreements had been implemented. This is all very, very sad. And my view is that it has come to the point where the very existence of Ukraine on a viable basis is at stake. And there needs to be a negotiation. You don't have to have a ceasefire for a negotiation, by the way. The Korean War was ended while both sides were fighting. They negotiated while fighting. And this is not abnormal at all. So it would be good to have a ceasefire because there are too many people being killed. But even without a ceasefire, the two sides should be brought back together. And perhaps the 12 principles the Chinese announced, which are unexceptionable, they are basically consistent with the UN Charter and international law, should be the basis of any such negotiation. But there is no negotiation in sight, and at the moment, both Moscow and Washington seem determined to fight to the last Ukrainian.
Do you see any will in the Biden administration to go after these negotiations, or you see that they're going to hand it over to the next president of the U.S.?
I think this has just been very greatly complicated by the Palestinian uprising from Gaza and the invasion of Israel by forces led by Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. And by the way, I should say, the problem is not Hamas. The problem is Israeli treatment of the Palestinians, which has become intolerable to the point where people are willing to die to make a point. But in any event, reflexive American support for Israel has cut in, and the Ukraine war and the war in Israel are being discussed in the same context. And it looked as though the United States Congress might be about to end American military aid to Ukraine, which would have forced Ukraine to negotiate. But now that it's connected with the support for Israel, I don't think that's going to happen. And so the answer is Mr. Biden's going into an election with a foreign policy track record that is frankly dismaying. He has got forever war going in Ukraine. There's no end in sight. He has now seen an uprising in the Middle East that is appalling in its violence. Hamas has done to Israelis what Israelis have been doing to Palestinians for the past 78 years, and scared the hell out of Israelis. 60,000 have already emigrated since this in the last week. The Middle East is a mess. Relations with Saudi Arabia are not good. It looks as though the Biden administration plans to cooperate with ethnic cleansing of Gaza by trying to get Egypt to open borders and let Palestinians leave Gaza. This will not win the United States any points in the region or in the Islamic world. There is a possibility that this war will broaden to include neighboring countries, and that there will be an upsurge of terrorist attacks on the West to answer Western support for Israel. And finally, relations with China and with Iran are terrible, going nowhere. So North Korea has developed an ICBM that can strike anywhere in the United States. So this is a foreign policy record that I would not want to run on if I were Mr. Biden, but that's what he has to run on as president.
Since you've mentioned this conflict in Israel, these international institutions like UN are not capable of solving these problems. The problem in Israel has been going on for such a long time, and nobody seems to care about the conflict in that region. Why we are not able to solve this conflict?
The United Nations had its origins in World War II and ideas that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had. And he began his plans for the post-World War II period based on the concept of spheres of influence. He had a concept which he called the four policemen. He said, let Moscow run Eurasia, let China run East Asia, let the British run the British Empire, let the United States run the Western Hemisphere. At the last minute, France was inserted because of its African empire as the fifth policeman. This is the basis of the Security Council. The General Assembly is one country, one vote, very much the Westphalian model, sovereign equality of states. The Security Council is not. There are vetoes for the 5 permanent members. And the United States, among others, including Britain and often France, has been committed to the protection of Israel from any consequences for its constant violations of international law. I think we have issued more than about 50 vetoes on behalf of Israel, preventing the UN from acting. So unless the United States and Great Britain and France join China and Russia in supporting an effort by the United Nations to mediate, there will be no such mediation. This is why many people believe that the organization of the United Nations needs to be re-examined. It basically is controlled by the victors in World War II, and the global constellation of power has shifted. Japan and Germany are both back as great powers in their regions. Africa is unrepresented. The Arab world is unrepresented. India is now a great power. Brazil and Latin America are not represented. So the UN, in many respects, is a prisoner of its history and the way in which it was organized.
Is this conflict in Israel going to shift the focus of the US from Ukraine to Israel?
I think many in the United States would prefer that it do so, because Ukraine has been a failure for the United States for the reasons I mentioned. This is very politically convenient to switch attention. On the other hand, many in the United States argue that the United States should focus on the consequences of the return of China to wealth and power. And in this context, the Middle East is a distraction. So people say, well, you should be trying to get out of the Middle East so you can focus on countering China. That is a very common statement in American politics. I don't know about Polish weapons for Israel, but I will say that the level of corruption in Ukraine, even before this war began, was quite amazing. Wars are always good for corruption. They increase it greatly. That has happened in Ukraine. There has been no effective control on what happens to the weapons sent over the border into Ukraine, and many of them have indeed been sold on the black market and probably have reached Hamas and others for whom they were not intended. And I suspect that many of them also have gone to places like Iran where they are being reverse engineered. So this war, as is common, one can recall what happened when NATO did its intervention in Libya. A huge supply of weapons left Libya and turned up in places like Syria and all over the Sahel in northern Africa, and fueled Islamist groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria. So there has been spillover from the Ukrainian war, but I don't know that the Poles are sending weapons to Israel. I have to ask, with $3.8 billion in U.S. aid to Israel militarily every year, and forgiveness of loans for weapons purchases to Israel, why it is that Israel needs more weapons. I mean, Hamas proved to be militarily very ingenious, improvising a very well coordinated and lethal attack, which included some horrible massacres of people, which I think was a political mistake for Hamas. Why is the existing Israeli force not adequate to deal with that? And again, this brings me back to the point. Hamas is not the problem. Hamas is the result of the problem. The problem is the intolerable conditions that Israel has created for the Palestinians. So if Israel succeeds, as it may, in wiping out Hamas, another movement will just grow up to replace it. The problem will not be solved.
Getting back to Ukraine war, the Biden's policy is the continuation of this war in Ukraine. Everybody knows that. If they continue this war, it can get nuclear and nobody can be safe on this planet. How dangerous is this, in your opinion?
If the propaganda that dominates the media in the West were true and Russia were losing this war instead of winning, then there might be a danger of escalation to the nuclear level. Russian nuclear doctrine says that if the state of Russia is in danger, that Russia should resort to nuclear weapons. But Russia's not losing, it's winning. So the danger of a nuclear escalation is very low. I don't think that the United States, Britain, France, all of which have nuclear weapons, are going to use them against Russia, because the consequences of doing that would be the destruction of all of those countries, ourselves, in the United States, the British, and the French. So we're not going to do that. And therefore, I don't think the danger of nuclear escalation is very great. Now, if the war turns against Russia, then I would again be concerned about this. But at the moment, I'm not.
Many lessons of the Ukraine war. What are these lessons, in your opinion? Could you mention these lessons that you think they are crucial and so important to understand?
If you are familiar with the basic tenets of sound statecraft, there's nothing new about what we're learning from this war. As I said, you should not start a war without knowing how you're going to end it and with whom and on what terms. And we don't have any clear objectives. The objective of weakening and isolating, that is a process. That is not an end. Furthermore, it turns out it's not feasible. I think the notion that sanctions can bring a great power to its knees is wrong. We have many decades of experience with sanctions now. What they mainly do is perpetuate dictators in power. You can look at North Korea, which has been subject to terrible sanctions for 70 some years, or Cuba, 60 years, or Iran, where maximum pressure is doing nothing whatsoever to bring down the regime. Quite the opposite. And I don't think sanctions make more enemies than they create friends. And so I think the final point here with regard to sanctions is that coercive diplomacy basically is not very effective. Diplomacy is persuasive when at its best, not coercive. I would also say that there is always collateral damage from conflict. In this case, there is a lot of collateral damage to the Western reputation in the so-called global South, or what the Russians are taking to calling the global majority. The focus of many countries on de-dollarization, removing the dollar as the means of trade settlement and replacing it with direct exchanges in local currencies, or perhaps another currency like the Chinese yuan, or an artificial currency if the so-called BRICS ever get around to creating such a thing. So you see a lot of collateral damage. The net result is the weakening and isolation of the United States, not Russia. You can see this. Almost nobody in the UN approved of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They all agreed it was illegal. But they did not want to take sides between the United States and Russia. They did not want a new Cold War. They do not agree with Mr. Blinken, the Secretary of State's notion of a rules-based order in which the United States makes the rules and enforces them as it pleases. They all have harked back to the rules-bound order of the UN Charter and international law, which are not unilateral, but consensual in their origins. So I think there are many lessons from this, but I guess I reveal my past as a retired diplomat. Maybe the largest one is don't count on military deterrence to do anything but aggravate problems. Use diplomacy. Never refuse to talk. If we had gone to a negotiation with Moscow, as Mr. Putin demanded in December 2021, even if we had turned up and said we don't agree with you about most of what you're demanding, we would not have had this war. If we had not tried to overthrow the Minsk Accords, Donbass would still be part of Ukraine. If we had not insisted on expanding NATO to include Ukraine, Crimea would be part of Ukraine. So I think underlying diplomacy is empathy, the ability to understand the perspective of your opposite number or opponent. There's no evidence of any empathy whatsoever by the United States in the run-up to this war. And I think we need to rediscover the merits of empathy-based diplomacy.